G'day there, it's Matt from Tassie here. I've built a few plywood sabres in my time. I've just finished building a foam sandwich sabre and trying to encourage people to have a go, so I want to share what I've learned. And a few other people in Tassie have built boats as well, and I want to include their ideas. So there's basically two ways to tackle building a foam sandwich boat. First way is the traditional way, where you would build a strong back and then erect on there some frames at the stations, put wooden stringers around that, and then drape foam over it, the foam shapes, and then secure that with screws from underneath through the stringers, and then glass it up on the outside and then take it off the jig, and you've got fairly much a boat already. The second way is to treat the foam as if they're sheets of plywood and basically build it like you'd do a stitch and glue ply boat. That's the way I used. I'll mention some of the advantages of the way a bit later on. Whichever technique you use, it's important to allow for the thickness of the foam and or the thickness of the stringers and the foam, so that the boat ends up the right dimension at the end. The association's got a CAD file which you can access, and from there you can get templates cut out, laser cut in either Mylar film or MDF, 3mm MDF, and that way you can use that to trace some shapes out. The other thing that's important to really get your head around is that the foam itself is a lot the stiffness is less than ply, and even when you've got a coat of glass on one side, it's still not as stiff as plywood, and that can cause you some trouble. It's only when you get the glass on the second side, so this is a cut out piece of the bulkhead, when you get the glass on the second side, it becomes really strong. So that's 6mm foam, just with a layer of 200 either side, that's as strong as. It's heaps stiffer than ply, but at that point it won't bend, so that's a bit of a drag. You have to be very careful that you don't build the panels too stiff before you get them into shape. When it comes to PPE, there's a few things you need. You need a respirator, working with any of the resins that are available. Some nitrile gloves work really well, or vinyl ones, but these last a long time. You can actually reuse them, they're that tough. Some earmuffs for when things are noisy, if you're grinding or sanding with power equipment, and some glasses for when you're grinding where bits are flying off, or if you're using MEKP hardener, watch out, that stuff's really dangerous on your eyes. When it comes to tools, you don't need much. In fact, I think with the stitch and glue technique, you could get away with using two tools. One, a drill, which is pretty straightforward, and the other one is a multi-tool with a little cutter on the end. Maybe 15 years ago, we laughed at a mate of mine who bought one of these, thinking that it was a joke, but it's actually a very versatile tool, and it's perfect for cutting the foam out when it's got fiberglass already on it. Do yourself a favour, buy yourself a tungsten tip, okay, and that'll last. I mean, I only bought one and it's lasted the boat and I can't see anywhere at all. If you just use a normal carbon steel, they won't last that long. So the tungsten works really well. When it comes to how much experience you need, I wouldn't recommend diving into this without you having some prior experience with using fiberglass, and maybe with epoxy, making fillets and that kind of thing. Do a simpler project first if you've got no experience with that, or get a mate to help you, somebody to show you some of the tricks. That way there's potential to run into trouble. If you build a ply sabre before, you'd probably be fine. The rules have changed, and you really need to just use the rules now to build the boat. So I'd recommend you read them multiple times to get your head around what's involved, what's important, which measurements are going to be critical to get right. maybe work with your state measurer to find out what's involved with measuring a Sabre, so you've got some idea about what you're going to be up against. You need to keep a track on things as you go so that you don't accidentally build in sizes or shapes that are going to be very difficult to fix later on. Okay, when it comes to using resin, which type of resin to use? So when we started building, you're only allowed to use polyester or vinyl ester. Epoxy wasn't an option. So, well, first up, I wouldn't use polyester at all. It eventually will get micro cracks in it and it'll get softer and it's not going to be very good. It's going to lose its strength. Vinyl ester, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. It stinks like hell. It doesn't adhere well to wood. And the MEKP hardener is really dangerous on your eyes. But it has the advantage it's a fair bit cheaper, maybe half or a little bit more than half than epoxy. It has no amine blush on it, which is an issue with epoxy. So you can laminate one day and come back 3 days later and just laminate straight over the top of it without, and still have maximum adhesion. So the surface of it stays slightly tacky, and so chemically the next vinyl ester will bond straight to it. So the epoxy's got very similar properties to vinyl ester. The epoxy does take longer to go off, which does give you a bit more work time. The epoxy will stick to just about anything, particularly wood. We think you'll need around about 20 litres, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. It's a good idea not to buy small containers because you'll end up wasting money. So buy 20 litres and decant it into smaller containers, ideally with a spout if you're using vinyl, or some pumps if you're using epoxy, or you can use, these are fairly cheap graduated containers and you can mix them up in that, which makes it easier. With epoxy, the amine blush can be a real drag. You've either got to scour it off with warm water or use something like peel ply. So this is what peel ply looks like terylene spinnaker cloth, or a bit like it. So once you've laminated, you then put the peel ply over it whilst it's wet and get enough resin on the peel ply, either coming up from underneath if you've got an excess, so you can just squeegee it down, or if it's staying too dry, you need to put some on top of this and again squeegee it down so you've got a perfectly wet out surface underneath. So when the epoxy's gone off, and well, you can use it on vinyl ester as well, which I did some of, when it's gone off, you then tear this off and the amine blush sits on the outside, disappears, and your epoxy is ready to laminate straight away. So although this costs a little bit, it'll save you a lot of time and mucking around trying to get rid of the amine blush. Okay, when it comes to the glass schedule, basically we guessed it. We had a bit of life experience. One of the guys was a builder, or had built boats before, and I'd built a few. And what we came up with is basically using 200 gram plain weave either side of the whole boat. So that's it. Some people might know it as 6 ounce, just a plain weave, warp and weft. So we use that over the whole boat, except about 400 or 450 on the bottom panels, in the cockpit area, any slamming areas in the bow, and where you sit. That schedule makes a really stiff boat, and it'll be easily down to weight. Somebody used 450 double bias, which is a great material. So it's got the glass running 45 degrees that way and then 45 degrees the other way. You get a really good glass to resin ratio because they're flat bundles, just stitched together. They're not woven. They're just flat bundles that way, flat bundles that way. So that works really well. But we now think maybe that 450 it makes the boat a bit heavy. So you might have to be careful in not using too much of that. When it comes to the foam, we used some Gurit foam, M80, which is 80 grams per cubic metre. And this is what it looks like. It's yellow in colour. You can see it's sort of bendy. You can also get, Gurit also make the PVC foam, which is green in colour. This one's got holes for vacuum bagging, but you can ignore those. This one works okay. It's a little bit floppier, which when you're building a stitch and glue boat can be a bit of a nuisance, trying to get it stiff enough to hold the shape before you put the second layer on. Yeah. When it comes to bending foam, and it's around the bow where you've got the maximum bend, we discovered something. The foam itself tends to want to, when you bend it, it wants to compress more than it does stretch more. So it compresses more on the inside than it does stretch more on the outside. And we didn't realise it was going to do that, but one of the impacts that you can see, I've got some glass on this side. If I put pressure on it, I can actually bend it around a fair way. If I go the other way, flip it over, so now the glass is on the inside, what happens, it'll just break. And we then realised eventually, after a few mishaps, that you can glass one side of the whole boat and put it together, but not the front panels. We'd suggest leave those without glass till you've got it pulled into shape and then glass it. You could also, one of the builders suggested maybe 6mm foam in the bow area rather than 8mm foam, but yeah, who knows? It's a little bit of trial and error, but I mean, I built my boat with 8mm foam in the bow and it went around okay. What I did have trouble with was the glass wanting, because I put it on the inside, the glass was wanting to pop off because the compression inside, the foam was trying to compress and pop the glass off in places. All right, now on to some pictures of building. Okay, on to building. I misquoted the Gurit foam there before. It's 80 kilos per cubic metre, not 80 grams. And watch out for that. It's called core cell. Watch out, there are other core cell foams that Gurit make, so we use the 80M version. All right, these first two pictures show a male mould approach. You can see the stringers screwed to either side of the keelson and the middle of the hull panels and along the chine. It's also got a 150mm MDF keelson, and that's slotted into the MDF frames. So the foam, once you've got the stringers on and you're happy with everything, the foam is laid over the stringers and secured in place with screws from inside through the stringers. Then once the joints are all bogged up, the bottom can be glassed, gunnels fitted, and then removed from the jig and flipped over to fit in the bulkheads. So the main advantages of the male mould approach is you can make multiple boats off the one jig. So that allows you to team up with others to share the effort to make the jig and the cost. You can double check the final shape and measurements and make adjustments before glassing the foam. You can shave a bit of foam off to make it a little bit smaller, or you could pack the stringer out locally to make it a bit bigger. The rocker and the hull panel curvature, they're set by the jig, and this is where this technique has an advantage over stitch and glue. Once it's sitting down on those stringers, that's it. It's locked in. The stitch and glue, there's some possible movement before the outside's glassed. This approach is a little bit less fiddly to bring the foam together at the chines. The main disadvantage of this technique is the cost and time to make the jig. Alternatively, you can stitch and glue, which is the technique I use, and it starts off fast. You can trace out the shapes onto your foam and cut them about 6mm bigger all the way around. This allows you to trim to exact size once one side has been glassed. I found the best way to cut shapes was with a sharp knife, and sometimes repeated strokes with a knife work best. Joining up the panels is easier than using pliers. You can just butt them together with glue. Remember, it's the glass either side that gives it the strength. Another advantage of foam is if you accidentally make a part too small, just glue foam on, and scraps can be joined together to make parts as well. It's worth the trouble to make up a temporary table long enough for the longest panels to make joining and glassing easier. Cover it with plastic sheet to prevent accidentally gluing the panel to the bench. Okay, onto glassing. Or roll out the glass onto the foam panel and trim off the excess. Then roll up the cut pieces and mark which end is which with a texto or something like that. Then it's time to screed on a coat of bog to fill the surface of the foam. It's important you do that. If you don't, it'll end up resin starved, which I found. I use West 411 filleting powder, mix it up with some resin to a thickened cream consistency and just screed it on with a plastic paddle or something like that. At this point, you can wait till it's gone off, sand off the dags and then apply the glass, or go straight ahead and just use wet on wet technique, which works fine and saves time. Once the glass has gone off, use a fine texter to mark the shapes out and cut out with a multi-tool. This is really nice, easy work. You can actually work quite accurately with the multi-tool. Once all the panels are glassed one side, well, except the bow panels, as I mentioned before, and trimmed to shape, you can discard the table and make up a building jig as described in the building notes. From here, much of the construction is just like a ply build. Some of the parts can be glassed both sides at this stage, so things like the bulkheads, transom, baffles, other bits and pieces, you can glass both sides. When it comes to wiring it up, I use 0.9mm steel handy wire to tie the boat together. You do need to be a little bit cautious when tightening, as the wire will cut through the foam and the glass if you overdo it. So if you've got some tricky areas, drill more holes and wires to stop yourself cutting right through. This picture shows the quick bit from flat panels to a boat shape in no time. You can see the prop there to keep the hull at the correct width, and getting bulkheads in and gunnels on to keep the correct shape. This picture shows the boat flipped over and checking for the foam. It is lying nicely along the chines and the keelson before bogging up the joints between the wires. This pic shows using wire and bookbinding tape helps bring the bow progressively together. With the gunnels, just bring them in progressively. I use wood, but you can use, there are other materials that would work. I don't know whether you could build one out of gunnels out of foam, maybe. Note that there's a notch there. I used a wire to progressively bring the gunnels together at the bow. These pics show getting the bulkheads in, and getting them in the right place can be fiddly. I used a few chamfered blocks of wood to temporarily screw things together. Once things were nicely in place, I used glue fillets to secure the bulkheads and then remove the blocks of wood. This picture shows where I've replaced the foam with wood, or you could use plywood, where the chain plates are bolted on, and this needs to be done wherever there are bolts or screws compressing the foam. So you need to think about where everything's going to be screwed on or bolted on before you glass the second side. This picture shows where I added about 3 or 4 layers of glass on the inside to spread the load out of the chain plates through the side panel and the bulkhead. I think a cedar block on the bow still works well. I just glassed it in. There's a notch out on top to support the deck beam. I built the front half of the deck beam from foam with unidirectional glass top and bottom. and the underneath the mast area, I made that from solid wood. Underneath that, a full foam bulkhead with glass both sides is lighter and much stronger than what manufacturers are currently using. They tend to cut it all out and made of plywood, and that's mainly because of the technique they're using to fit the deck to the hull. But I think a full foam bulkhead there is a really smart move. This picture shows, it looks a bit complicated, but until the bottom is glass both sides, when you're using stitch and glue, both the rocker and the bottom panel curvature can move. Now I decided to make up some ply girders to lock the shape in place. I used hot glue gun to tack weld them in place, and then check the rocker measurements before flipping it over and glassing the bottom. Once you have got the second side glass, there's no more movement. You cannot alter it then unless you cut everything apart. This is an example where the male mould jig has an advantage over stitch and glue. On to glassing up the bottom, it's a good idea to pre-cut and roll up your glass first. It just makes it a little bit easier. So then you can screed the foam with some filler, unroll a short section of the glass and wet that out before moving on. I was working by myself, but if you've got other people, you can actually speed this process up. So I mixed up batches of resin about 250 ml at a time. I made sure the laminating is perfect before moving on to the next section, particularly if you use vinyl ester, because you haven't got too much work time. So you can see there the PPE I'm using, rubber squeegee, plastic paddle for moving excess resin around. Make sure you've glassed the underside of the decks before gluing down, left and right handed. One of the builders made a small mistake there. Use clamps around the outside edge and book binding tape on the inner joint. Tape down the ends of the tape with a longitudinal strip of tape, as if you don't, the tapes can slowly release when under tension, and just as you leave the job and walk away for a well-earned beer, they pop off as the lights are turned off. I've had that happen to me. Check the hull for twist before your decks go on. So use a spirit level is easiest, one on the transom, and then check at the main bulkhead and get the hull without a twist. Once any of the decks are on, the twist in the hull is pretty much locked in. This picture shows a few extra stiffeners I put under the front decks. I was a bit worried about if you climb up on there to paddle your way back in, you might end up breaking those. These pics show where your cleats and mast go, and so you've got to work that out and replace the foam with wood or ply before you glass the deck. Where the chain plates come through the deck, it's a good idea to dig out the foam and replace it with some high strength glue or some filler mixed up with chopped off short bits of fiberglass. So you've got really good compressive strength there, because the chain plates are trying to pull the deck in and they will start to drag it in over time if that hasn't got good compressive strength there. The centre case and the thwart can be made as one unit from foam and wood. And I made some little curves there, a bit like the manufacturers did. So you can thermoform the foam. It's really easy. You just heat it up with either a radiator or a heat gun, then bend it, hold it till it's cool, and you've got a curve. When you join the case and the thwart together, make sure the case is vertical and the thwart's horizontal. So you can use a spirit level there, that works quite well. This picture shows a thwart and the case glued in place with fillets and then glass to the floor and the side tanks. This picture is the keelson glued in place before it's glassed over. Note the foam removed and the block of wood in place for the main sheet attachment pulley. An alternative to this, to using wood inserts or ply inserts, such as where the rudder pindles bolt through, is to drill oversized holes with a spade bit or something like that and fill with high strength glue. Then you can drill smaller bolt holes through the centre, and that will be nice and strong and able to withstand compressive strength. This is a picture showing an extra layer of glass where you sit. So 200 grams either side of the foam is heaps strong enough, but it doesn't have dent resistance. So it will still dent. Even sitting on top of the knots on the control line ends will dent it, as one of the builders found out. So 400 grams where you sit is minimum. Another spot where there's compressive force on the foam is where the centre case exits the hole. So one way to go there is use a multi-tool to dig out the foam a bit and replace it with high strength glue. Fitting the venturi can be a bit tricky. Work out what height you need to suit the make of venturi you've got. So mark it out, jigsaw the hole or use the multi-tool, trim out to the depth with a router or trimmer, and use the multi-tool to bevel the edges and then glass it over, and then peel ply over the top of that to give you a nice smooth finish. Alright, this is now the fun starts. Alright, you've built a glass and foam boat, but now you need to screed the whole thing with microlight filler. Or you can use other fillers if you're going to paint your boat black, but if you want to paint it a light colour, microlight is easy to work with and it sands really well, and it's super lightweight. So it's a case of sand it, bog it, sand it, bog it, bog it, sand it, till you get to the standard you're happy with. And then whack on a coat of high build, and that'll show up all the defects that you missed. So then it's bog and sand, bog and sand. It's a bit of a drag, that part of building the boat. When it comes to paint, I'd recommend using 2-pack paint. If you've got all this trouble, use a paint that you're not going to have to redo every few years. Even in the sun, the 2-pack paint will last, best part of 8 years. So if you keep the boat under a cover or in the shed, it'll last. Well, it'll outlast most people. Really good stuff. I've had good results with using Wattle Epinamel High Build and Poly U 400. They're both good products which work really well. I'd say there, do not cut any corners with PPE there. And 2-pack paints, they're awfully toxic, and if you're spraying them, it's even worse. So this stuff is not designed to be breathed in, and you'll do yourself serious damage with these paints if you don't follow the correct PPE. The last step there is rig it up, just like a ply sabre. There's no difference in the rigging, and get out there and enjoy a sail. Well, we've had plenty more discussions, and we're now thinking the male jig is the way to go, especially if you can team up with other people to make it much easier to share the load there. My own build does prove that stitching glue works and it is viable, so it's a case of taking your pick, you think. With the resin options, we're thinking the epoxy would be the way to go now that the rules have changed and you're allowed to use it. Maybe foam is the future for Sabre amateur builds. You get a stiffer hull and it's easily built down to weight. You've got low maintenance, and it's likely to keep its performance level as built for decades. So keep in mind you're not building a wooden boat, so it's a little bit light on for sole. What it does have though is plenty of yourself wrapped up in it, and you could take quite some pride when people come along and realise you've built it yourself. making a dinghy with your own hands is something special in this day and age. So hopefully the video inspires you to have a go. So if you watch this far, you might be thinking, well, yeah, but you know, are they fast? At the recent Tassie States, the 3 foam boats were first, second and fourth. But we can't tell if it's the sailors, the new Steve Walker sails, or the boats. Let's just say the boats aren't slow. Cheers.